Good morning and welcome to this session on how nature teaches us to grieve, part of Good Grief Festival this March. I'm Aisling Mustan and I'm part of the team that organises Good Grief Festival, and I'd like to welcome everybody at home here today, particularly those who are going through a difficult time. We really hope that you find some comfort and maybe some wisdom in this session, and we're really delighted to have you here. I'm also delighted to have the wonderful Mary Kennedy and Gary Andrews here with me today. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Great to have you here. I'm actually going to hand over to you guys to introduce yourselves very briefly, just sort of talk a little bit about who you are and your work. And I'm going to go to you first, Mary.
Thanks, Aisling. Yeah, I don't know. I'm a teacher, I'm a guide, I'm a coach. I suppose at the center of my work is an inquiry about wisdom and how do we live wisely. And I'm really curious about bringing modern and ancient wisdom together, you know, and my real interest is in women, like how do we live wisely as women in the 21st century? So that, you know, the wisdom of my ancestors, of the Celtic tradition, the wisdom of the more modern world, this amazing wisdom we have from depth psychology and developmental psychology and neuroscience, and how do we bring them together so we can live more wisely and start to really, you know, birth a new world as women. And I do that through teaching. I teach yoga, I teach the Celtic Wheel. I gather women and we work with the Celtic Wheel, and then I leadership coach with women, just how to live and lead in the world in that way that's wise and skillful and generative for ourselves and our communities and our relationships.
Thanks, Mary. I think that piece around the Celtic Wheel is really interesting and something that we'll be bringing into the conversation a lot, of how to live more wisely with the seasons and how to turn to them when we need wisdom and healing, and how, you know, those avenues are always available to us in nature. So I'm really looking forward to bringing that into the conversation. Thank you. And Gary Andrews, would you like to talk a little bit about who you are and what your work is?
Yeah, well, I'm an illustrator and cartoonist, and you know, that's what I do for a living, basically. But I also keep a doodle diary online that looks at my life and life in general. And about 3.5 years ago, my wife died, and my doodle diary became a self-counseling project, a way of sort of working through my grief through creativity and drawing. And it's led to a book and ending up giving lots of talks about positive grieving, and people, it seems to sort of be helping people, which is rather lovely and a positive thing to come out of something so dark. And Joy and I also lived our life following similar traditions, the old ways and the Celtic Wheel and the sort of pagan path, if you like. And so this ties in quite nicely to what Mari's going to be talking about today.
That's great, Gary. Thank you. I think you're underselling yourself a little bit. I would describe you as a worldwide sensation. Your doodles have touched millions of people, hundreds of thousands of people all over the world, and your book, Finding Joy, is incredible and incredibly moving. So welcome to Gary as well. I think as we're a grief festival, and a lot of people who'll be here with us today are either grieving or working in the area of grief, I'd like to touch on both of your experiences of grief as well. And then we can kind of talk about a little bit more about how nature became part of your healing process. And I'll go to you first again, Mary.
Yeah, it's funny. I was thinking of this, you know, having to come on here, I was thinking, wow, yeah, grief. And I thought, you know, there's so many different kinds of grief and, you know, times of loss. But I remember the first time that I felt I went through grief was I was 28 and I was heartbroken. My boyfriend had left me. And I remember thinking even back then, my God, this is the first time anybody has left me or died, or, you know, and in a way I felt very privileged because I was, you know, 28 before that happened. And then, of course, my marriage split up, and there was a big disruption in my life. And I went into a death phase really in my life, and that was a death of my identity, and there was a lot of grief around that, but it was quite delayed because it was such a shock to me. And then my father's passing was much more profound, much more immediately profound, because I was so close to him. And even though we had, a year, 9 months, a year, we knew that he was on his Shlina on the way of the truth, which is the death, moving towards death. That was a heartbreaking loss for me, and deep grief that brought me into a very deep place. And then more recently, I'm at the end of my perimenopause, / menopause. And there's a deep grief around a loss of youth and a loss of dynamism, which I think often isn't, when I worked with it in myself, I couldn't believe the level of grief. And I think often we're afraid to talk about that because we shouldn't be, grieving our youth. We should just naturally walk into our elderhood. But I was really, really amazed by the level of grief I felt recently when I did a ritual around it for myself. Yeah. So those are kind of a couple of flashpoints over my life cycle that touch points of grief. Yeah, touchstones.
That's really interesting, bringing in the idea of the menopause, perimenopause as well, because obviously grief is related to, of course, the death of somebody, but we experience grief on an everyday basis as life sort of slips away from us a little bit more. Not to make it sound too depressing, but we are sort of confronted with loss and grief every second of every day in so many ways. And I think for me, I do turn to nature, because nature is exactly the same. Everything is turning on a tiny point every single day. And even in the winter, and this is something, Mary, that I know that it was a teaching that really touched me, was the idea that even in winter, when everything is completely underground and it's completely barren, there's so much happening underneath the surface that we just can't see. So I think, it was really interesting that you bring that in. Gary, would you like to talk about your experience of grief?
Yeah, I mean, slightly different story, I guess, with me. I was a only child, but both my grandfathers died before I was born. My maternal grandmother died when I was 3. My paternal one died when I was 7. And then my father died when I was 28. And 3 years later, my mother died. So at sort of 31, I'd sort of lost every significant person in my close family. So I'd covered a lot of early grief in that period, I suppose. There then followed a brief period of me in my 30s acting like a teenager, and then I met Joy, and the love of my life, and we had 19 fantastic years. And then, as I said earlier on, tragically in 2017, she died at just 41, completely unexpectedly, from sepsis, which was the biggest, most traumatic, life-changing grief I went through. Because, although losing my parents and stuff at a fairly young age, it was still the right way round, if you know what I mean. You expect to lose your parents, but you don't expect to lose your partner, especially when you're that much older and a male. And so that was a sort of the big one for me. And it was at that point that I really, on a personal level, confronted what grief meant to me and what my beliefs meant and how I handled it in that respect. And it was at that point when I realized that the sort of nature-based spirituality that I had kicked in and sort of held me through the whole thing, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. And it reminds me of these quotes, a couple of quotes that really stood out to me that I wanted to kind of bring up today. There's a great quote by Aristotle: to appreciate the beauty of a snowflake, it is necessary to stand out in the cold. And I just thought that was so beautiful and so poignant, but also just such an incredible one-liner on the process of grief and where it takes you. I think it'd be really interesting to bring in a little bit about the Celtic Wheel and about the seasons, and about, we're here in Britain, and we have audience all over the world, some who won't be familiar with the Celtic Wheel, and also some of the pagan traditions around the seasons and the cycles of the seasons, and how we relate that to the cycles of our lives. Mary, would you be able to kind of sum that up?
Yeah. How long do we have? I think at its heart, like the Celtic tradition, and that archaic mind was so attuned to nature that it certainly for me, what I was really aware, it broke me out of my linear mind, that and brought me into an awareness that of the interconnectedness of everything, and that linear mind, is very straight lines. It's like it thinks in straight lines. It's the science, and it's a really important part of our abilities. But actually, when we're just existing from the linear place, we're often very disconnected from nature. So for me, it brought me into this more circulinear way of perceiving, a different way of knowing than I had been brought up to. And I grew up in a farm, but my education, my socialization was all really to just fill me up with information and not connect me with the seasons, not connect me with the great intelligence of nature. So the Celtic Wheel, I suppose, to bring it in, it's a ritual calendar that was left by our ancestors. Not just the Celts, the pre-Celts as well, but that what it does is it really teaches us about cycles, and how that in death, like when we live in a linear world and in a linear perception, we just think we're born and we die. It's a straight line, and along that trajectory we'll have a few ups and downs, but generally we're trying to achieve all the time, get things, hit the different parts, school, college, marriage, whatever, all of those pieces along the road. But the road's pretty straight. Whereas when we come into the Celtic mind and the Celtic tradition and the Celtic Wheel in particular, it's like it's 8 seasons. Every 6.5 to 7 weeks, we've got a ritual that really speaks to that turning. You said, Aisling, there about turning on a dime. It's like there's changing all the time, but at particular times there's a rhythm where everything is honored. All the changes are honored. So every 6.5 weeks, the Celts honored, the different parts of the cycle, which brought different energies. So we've death is the beginning of the cycle, and they really honored that. So everything was sacred, because in that earth-based, time of spirituality, everything was sacred. And so it's something we've really lost in our world. So I don't know whether that brings it, but it certainly, because then we have death and birth. Everything is in this exquisite complexity of polarity, and you get to really, as you walk the Celtic Wheel, it's a map for our time, I really believe, of remembering this other way of knowing and not knowing, not just another way of knowing, but of not knowing. So I don't know whether, and in terms of death, it honors death. It doesn't say death is easy. Like the Celtic people, it was bleak. They didn't have enough food, but they prepared. They were prepared. So they honored and celebrated at the harvest. And then they got themselves ready for the descent into the darkness. And in that, they knew that, and they trusted deeply that the sun would return. So even though the days were dark, they weren't working. They put their tools down. They stopped working in agricultural terms. They rested and waited. And then at the winter solstice, the sun returned. And now, as we're coming to the lovely spring equinox, we're right at the high point of spring. So I'm not sure, but certainly the season of death in the Celtic tradition is from Samhain to Imbolc. Samhain at Halloween, October. That's the beginning of the year, the new year. Even that alone is everything starts in the darkness. Right to Imbolc, which is the beginning of spring, first couple of weeks in February.
Yeah, and then you have the classic autumn, which is just watching the leaves fall and seeing that beauty of the autumnal color show. before the trees let go. And it's this kind of exquisite letting go that sort of teaches us almost how to do it through this kind of profound beauty, which I think, there are so many festivals throughout the world that center around that time of year that are related to death and honoring the dead. Not just in this part of the world, but in South America, and I think almost all cultures have some kind of nod to that. Not at that particularly that time of year, but at different times of year as well. So I think, Mary, that's beautiful and really well summed up. And can I just say, my questions are in linear format, and I'm actually going to jump around. I'm going to go Celtic Wheel on this.
Bring us into the labyrinth of your questions. Yeah,
going to go circular. Gary, I'd like to ask you about your experiences. When Joy died, obviously it was incredibly sudden, and she was very young, and you had 2 children. You were also out of the country when she died. So there's all of these very traumatic circumstances around Joy's death that were, I'm sure, incredibly hard to deal with. What I'd like to ask you is, after Joy died, how did nature provide a comfort to you, and how did those pagan beliefs and pagan, the way, because you celebrated them together?
We did, and we had done for years. And she died 4 days before Samhain, which is Halloween. So, unlike the Halloween tradition, the Samhain tradition, you're honouring the ancestors. It's when the veil is the thinnest between our world and the other world, and you're in touch with the ancestors, and you give thanks to the ancestors for everything they've given you. So the fact she died so close to that, in a way, when Samhain came along, like 4 days later, I could light a candle, and it was like she just joined the ancestors. So instead of feeling, yes, I was totally bereft and heartbroken and lost, obviously, but there was also that sense of that she joined this greater power, this greater other side, where she was now part of something I could look to at that time of the year. It's really hard to sort of put into words, but there was a sort of comfort in knowing she was part of this greater consciousness, if you like, of what had gone before. And it's also looking at the nature terms as well. As you say, you're looking at the trees falling at that point and the leaves going into the ground. But when you see the leaves lying on the ground, you see that they are feeding new growth. Mm-hmm. And I sort of took from that, as the time went by, there's a new growth in yourself. You've had this loss, but out of that loss, there's a new birth in a new kind of you, and a new kind of way you have to live your life. And so I sort of took that on board as well at the same time. And in practical terms, we did very physical things with it. So when Joy died, and she was cremated, and then a couple of months later, in February, actually, round about Imbolc, in fact, we had a tree planted, and her ashes were put in the hole where the tree was growing. But also at her passing ceremony that we'd asked people to bring along organic things like leaves, feathers, fruit, nuts, whatever, and put them in a cauldron, as it were, with a thought or a memory or a wish about her. And all that went into the root hole with the tree and the ashes. So all these memories went in stuff that was going to rot into the ground and then feed this new life of the tree. And that became very symbolic of how we went forward, thinking about her and thinking about moving on. So that's how we sort of took that element of it on board.
That's really lovely. And I think that, in an increasingly secular society, part of the thing that we're missing is ritual and an ability to kind of celebrate and memorialize people. We kind of it feels like we're between things at the moment, and we are sort of, I think, for a lot of people, searching for ways to find meaning.
Well, I think acknowledging that we are part of that whole wheel. I mean, and you've got the wheel of the year, which also is echoed in the wheel of life as well, in the circle of life, in growth and death and rebirth. It's all tied in together, and we are just part of that. So, when we're born, this energy coalesces and becomes this person. When we die, that energy goes back out into the greater universe, and you become part of the whole again, So acknowledging that was a sort of important part, and talking about that with my kids as well. When they said, what happens when you die? And I say, well, nobody really knows, but lots of people believe lots of things. And I told them what different religions believed. And I told them what I believe, which is that we are part of this general energy that comes together and then goes away. And So if they wanted, you know, mum after she'd gone, all they got to do is look at that leaf, that bird, that breeze, that sunbeam, whatever. That's all her. So she's everywhere whenever they want her, you know, sort of thing. That's how I sort of explained that. And that's how I feel. That's how I feel. I feel she is everywhere in a very true sense, you know.
That's so lovely. Really lovely. I wonder as well about the idea of grieving and the idea of going into your grief, which for decades we've sort of, I guess, been put under pressure not to do. And that's quite a broad generalization, but I think in general we have been sort of encouraged to get on with things, get back to work, keep yourself busy, you know, don't give in to it, it'll swallow you
Stiff
whole.
upper lip.
Stiff upper lip, yeah. They worked that one out after the Second World War, First World War, and we got stuck with that for a while. And it feels like there's kind of a bit of a movement happening at the moment towards people being able to see grief as a very natural, very normal, very adaptive part of life. There's a quote that I pulled up from our dear friend Julia Samuel, who's we love her here at Grieve. And she says that pain, as much as we never want to feel it and want to do what we can to avoid it, is the way that we adjust to a new reality. And I think that's so. I think it's, as with all of Julia's advice, she's on the money with that. And Mary, I wanted to kind of ask you, do you think we've become pain averse as a society, and that nature teaches us that it's okay to let go into that grief and to go into that darkness because spring will come again, and that it's avoiding the pain and this kind of societal obsession we have with carrying on and keep on going and, you know, to be kind of on and achieving all the time, that perhaps we have become averse to pain and we are now afraid of it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a subtle thing, but I think we're in such pain, actually, in the avoidance, because it's the struggle that causes the real suffering, you know, the struggle against what is, and what is in life is death. From the moment we're born, we are dying. And, you know, that's quite kind of profound and existential, and we don't all go around thinking like that. But actually, it's in moving towards the discomfort, moving into the pain, moving and turning towards it is where we will find there is ease and soothing, you know, and neuroscience, you know, what we know about neuroscience too, no more than what we know from the Celtic people who absolutely honored and went into the darkness and the uncertainty. Will the sun return? Will we have enough food to keep us through the winter? They moved in with a deep bow towards it. And that is, it's like, if we can, we're just in this, you know, you said that we're encouraged to stay away from the pain or to avoid and just get on with it. I think we're rewarded for that. You know, all our structures that are now crumbling have rewarded us for always being on, never stopping, never resting, because this need to be certain, to know what's coming, to know what's the outcome of everything we do, and so actually, my sense is we are in immense pain. We're in the realms of hell a lot of the time, and we're just busying ourselves or soothing ourselves with, you know, whether it's too much work or too much of anything. I mean, I did it myself. I have to watch it every day, that I am not moving away from myself, moving away from the pain of being a human on the planet right now is massive. And how can I be present to that? And I don't know whether that answers it, but I don't think it's as straightforward as just we're trying to avoid pain. I think we're in pain, and a lot of the time, yeah, maybe it is as straightforward as that. When we go to it, you know, when we go and meet it and meet the pain inside us, the grief inside so many of us, that's when the real liberation happens from the pain.
A lot of people try to fight it, don't they? And sort of, you know, not surrender to that moment of letting it go. And I think, you know, we're all have been guilty of that sort of thing. And I remember learning from my children that, you know, I remember 2 or 3 days after Joy died, seeing my son just have a complete sort of anger breakdown and sort of just thrashing and beating and pummeling the hell out of the sofa. So, and I'd been being, you know, although I'd cried, I'd been sort of strong still, you know, but a couple of nights later when they were in bed and I felt that same anger well up, instead of trying to sort of go, no, I'm fine, I let that go, and I did the same as he'd done. And you suddenly go, oh, okay, I realize actually that that's what my body, that's what everything, all my instincts are telling me to do. And it felt better to acknowledge that pain was there rather than try and fight it and hide it and push it under. And it's acknowledging those moments of the darkness that then releases those little bits of pressure they're causing. It's kind of what, you know, with me, it was the process of doing that with the doodles. If I had a dark day and I drew one, by the fact of drawing it and letting that out, it instantly made that bit of pain feel better because I'd acknowledged it. So I think it is the acknowledging rather than the suppressing or ignoring that's so important.
I love that. Yeah. And that reminds me of that time. I remember the day I got the word that my dad was diagnosed with cancer, and every sinew in my body, every impulse wanted to get into the car, drive to the west of Ireland and just make tea and make sure everyone was okay. And I made a decision not to. I said, no, like that's the good girl way of doing things. That's me trying to save everybody. And I made a decision, no, I'm going to do this journey. I'm not going to hide for 1 minute my heartbreak. And as a result, I had the most beautiful 9 months of intimacy with my father that I wouldn't have had I just gone down and made some tea and said, okay, everybody, you know, it's okay, we'll get through this. I used to throw myself on him when he would come out of hospital and just be weeping. And he just, you know, it was so amazing because he just went, oh my God, you know, he was able to see the joy of that in just being able to see his daughter, who was absolutely heartbroken, and not hiding it or pretending or avoiding it. And it really changed me completely when I moved through that journey with him in that way, rather than the old way, which I would have been, you know, just get on with it. It'll be okay. We'll be fine. Missing out so much of that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And Catherine Mannix talks about this as well in her book. Catherine is a palliative care doctor and an amazing author as well. And she talks about how you can repress the pain and it's very possible to do that, but then you're missing all of the other emotions as well. And you're numb to everything and you're numb to life. And you're missing the extraordinary craziness of life by blocking yourself off to the pain, and that by really experiencing grief, that's where we find, you know, the true light and living in the light and being able to, and I know, Mary, you talk a lot about this, of living between the lightness and the dark and being able to, you know, pick up those two poles and kind of maneuver your way easily between them.
Which is exactly, again, ties in so perfectly with the wheel. At every point on the wheel, you've got the balance across the wheel. Midsummer, the brightest, sunniest, most beautiful day, you know, the Oak King and the Holly King are fighting, as it were, in the woods, and Holly wins, which means from the moment you've hit midsummer, you're heading back into winter. And the flip side, in the middle of winter, you know, as soon as the Oak King has won on the winter solstice, the light is coming back. So there's always this flip side, this opposite going on. In the darkest dark, the shoots are coming through of the green and all that. And I think it's the same with the grief. In the darkest moments of your grief, those little green shoots are going to be there underneath, waiting to come through, you know.
I love that. I didn't know that metaphor. I love it.
Beautiful. Yeah, me neither. I knew that at the moment of the winter solstice, the summer solstice is born, that we so forget, you know. But
in the darkest night of your soul, then the light is born. Yeah, it's amazing. Mary, you have studied a lot about the ancient traditions, and I was just wondering, do you have a feel for what did our ancestors understand about that nature of death and loss? And also, have we somewhat, not lost, but misplaced that along the way?
Yeah, that's the question. That's the answer to the second part is definitely we've lost. I mean, I know in myself I lost it. I know the moment I realized that there had been some disruption in in this way of knowing. And it was in my, just after my dad had died, and I was attending my first Celtic Wheel retreat. And the great woman who became my teacher, Dolores Whelan, said, everything starts in the darkness. For the Celts, everything started in the darkness. And I just had this massive visceral moment of a sense of course, like the womb, we start in the womb, the darkness of the womb, the Big Bang. It all starts in the darkness. And that was for me a key into, there was such relief in my whole system, that because I'd been kind of through 7 years of a lot of losing a lot and change, a lot transforming, and a whole period of loss. And it just helped to make sense of it. So for me, that's, the Celts did that, and that Celtic mind, or that more archaic mind, because it was able to hold everything sacred. I was aware that in my life and in this modern world, we deny a lot. There's death denial of death all the time. And so we push things away, as you were saying, Gary. It's like everything, it gets repressed, it goes into the shadow. And then we're trying to make sense of the world when these things happen. So to go back and to touch in with them, like just that capacity to surrender, what you were saying, Gary, just living in honoring polarity. Again, what usually happens is we attach to one pole, and in the modern world, it's the achievement, very much more the masculine way of, and it's become the unhealthy masculine way of living. And the Celts would always, through their wisdom, I've learned we have to pick up the other pole, which is the feminine pole, which is, how do we rest? How do we need to rest, we need to hibernate, we need renewal. I used to work in organizations, and all they cared about was like, okay, high performance team. How do we get a high performance team? And nobody was thinking about, to get a high performance team, you need renewal and rest. And so, but it's all this more higher, bigger, brighter, better, faster, this world we've created. So, they understood these cycles, and they understood, they had a particular way of knowing. And even as you say, Gary, the different realms, and we can, poo-poo that and say, oh, that's a load of woo-woo. But actually, it's different ways of knowing, and different access to different, like the soul of the world, the animus mundi, that we are part of that, and we have access to that. It was, in the Celtic tradition, the other world. This was a place of wisdom and healing, where we would access that. You can, when I go out my door, I can only travel 5 kilometers, but once I can be anywhere close to the earth or ground or a tree, I have access to that.
And I think you don't have to be literal as well, do you? I think that's the thing with the old beliefs. They thought about things in the world they understood, and they would personify and give things nature. The other world, doesn't have to be a specific place. It's symbolic of the sum of knowledge. It's the sum of knowledge of what's gone before. It doesn't. There's no reason to say it has to be. For me, like the gods are symbolic of the forces of nature. That's that sort of thing. It's nature itself, which is the overriding thing. Us all being part of this big machine that is this planet on which we live, and we're just a cog in that wheel. But if you acknowledge that also gives you a sense of being part of something bigger, rather than thinking the world revolves around me and everything is so important. And when actually, if you just acknowledge that you're part of a bigger thing, there's a sort of a comfort to be taken from that, really, as well, I think. Definitely. And I think, Gary, we've done a few events with you, and the question that comes up again and again and again is like, wow, they just did it so well. They just got grief. But I think it sounds like you just allowed grief to kind of take you in a way, that you went exactly.
Where.
Yeah, I didn't have any. I didn't sort of follow a pattern. I didn't follow it. I just sort of went with my instincts from day one, from the first moment. I didn't sort of conform, I suppose. But I just let it take me where it did. You're the feather on the river going along, and just letting it go where you get taken. So if I felt like I felt a certain thing one day, I went with it, and that was it just felt, I mean, again, because everything else was about nature and about living part of that life, the grief journey for me was exactly the same. And yeah, everything just, I never questioned it for a moment. It just seemed quite natural, really, just a sort of simple response to it. And yeah, I mean, I'm learning that perhaps it wasn't quite what a lot of people do, but it did seem to work for me. And yes, of course there's the pain, but you acknowledge that pain. Yeah, no, it was I think it's about openness, wasn't it? It's about openness as well. It's about acknowledging it's there. It's about talking about it. It's not hiding behind anything. And, you know, that's also an important part of the whole process, I think. And that's what events like this are all about. Talking about it, discussing it, and breaking those taboos and getting it out in the open. Every single one of these conversations, every time someone listens to one of these and you can just open a little door for somebody, that's a step forward, a step into the light again for people.
Gosh, absolutely. I mean, yeah, and I think that we need to model good grief, and because we're still learning in a lot of ways. And I know, you know, I had a lot. My father died when I was 3.5, and nobody modeled good grief. Nobody grieved. It just was. It was really. I felt like I had to trap it inside, and I felt like I was holding my breath for about 22 decades of my life. And so I think it's really amazing that people like you are modeling it, but then talking about it and drawing about it. And I think it's really incredible. I also think another thing that really struck me about what you were saying is that being very connected to the seasons and the natural flow of the seasons, I think potentially helps us to be more connected to the natural flow of our emotions, that we don't think, oh my God, I'm going to get trapped in despair. I'm going to get trapped in anger. I'm going to get trapped in sadness. And that we understand more that if you just allow them, that you work through them and you come out the other side. And that's exactly the same with the seasons. You know, it's like, you can't have autumn, you can't have summer without winter. So yeah, I think there's profound wisdom in what you say there, for sure.
Yeah, I love that, Aisling. I think that's a really important piece. It's like when to move in and when to move out. And as you say, Gary, it's like the acceptance. Can I accept that this death is happening to me?
Yeah. I mean, the circumstances can be awful, and you know, and it's hard to accept sometimes the circumstances. I mean, you know, everybody's experience of, you know, of bereavement is different, and some things are harder to face than others, I guess, in a lot of ways. But at the same token, death itself is this, if you can accept and face that, you know, yes, you can rail against the circumstances, and that's fair enough. That's only natural. But once you can get past that bit intellectually and then just go emotionally with the acceptance of, okay, it's happened.
Which is
that's
it. Like
it's huge.
Again, the stages of grief, it's a bit like the seasons. They teach us that it's okay. You're going to be like your children moving into the anger, you know. But it's when we don't allow ourselves the time, which I think is what our modern world doesn't allow for.
And also, some years, you know, winter seems to go on forever, and you have a really crappy spring, and then summer comes along, and it's, you know, there's no sort of timetable we're following with this wheel of the emotions and the wheel, you know, it will come round, but it might take a while. Yeah. Or it might happen quick. It might be a lovely year and it comes quick, and the happiness can come sooner. So again, looking at nature that way and seeing that every year, although it follows the cycle, the lengths of each individual section can often change. And that it's the same with the cycle of your emotions. And so don't be impatient. Why aren't I happy yet? I've been sad for a bit now. I need to be happy again because that's what I'm supposed to. It's like it'll come round.
So true. It's like, oh, I've already done sad. Sad is done. I've
done sad now.
Yeah, it's so true.
And that resistance is so much part of being human. And I think it's a very important part of the process. You know, it's not that, oh, let's surrender. You know, there's a lot of like, we should just let go. We should just surrender. Nature can do that. We are very different to nature because we have been conditioned in a particular way. So this is us returning, but we have to really be compassionate towards the part that is kicking and screaming underneath, saying, no, I don't want this anymore. I want things to be better. And I know even when my marriage split up, I was in a relationship, 8 weeks later or 6 weeks later, I wanted to be in spring, and by damn, I was going there. I didn't want to go into the winter solstice, but I had to learn, because you're pulled back into Samhain again. I had to meet that pain that I was avoiding, or I was pushing away. I had to meet it again, and I had to do a couple of the spirals, deeper and deeper into the spiral. So the shedding happens. You shed more, and you learn more, and you resist, and then you surrender, and it's a process, and it's to just let the goddess of the Celtic tradition of winter, of Samhain, is the Cailleach. She's the hag, and if you let her kiss you, she will turn into the maiden at spring. But you gotta really let her kiss you, or you gotta go and kiss her, and she's not that beautiful at times. There's a great legend of Niall of the Nile hostages, who he was this great king of Ireland, High King of Ireland, but before I think he became king, he and his brothers went out and they were hunting, and they were really thirsty, and they came to this a stream, and there was a hag there, and she had like mossy teeth and limbs that were all crooked, and she was really pretty awful, and each one of them were sent to ask her could they have water, and she said, if you kiss me, you can. And each of them were like, no way. And then Niall came up and said, I will not just kiss you, but I will lie with you. And as soon as he did that, she turned into the maiden. And this is what it takes. Like, we will resist it. We don't want to be in the harsh, bleak winter and the pain of that. And it's okay to resist it too, and to be really deeply compassionate with ourselves in those moments when we just want to be in spring. We just want everything to go back to normal, or we want something new. We want to be okay in the certainty of, and the growth, which is much more easy on our system.
That's gorgeous, Mary. That's amazing. And I think also that's what our society teaches us that we should be doing as well. That it's kind of not okay. I went through a grieving process recently, and I did just shut up shop for a month, and I walked a lot in nature, and I gave in to some very difficult emotions, and I cried, and but oh my God, was it profound, and to just but it was really interesting. It really worried some people. They kind of, were like, oh, you can't be okay. You're up there on your own, and you're like, I'm fine. I'm really fine. I've got good anchors. I know what I'm doing. So there's a fear about it as well from the people who are supporting you, that they think that's bad grief, that you're going down the rabbit hole and you're not going to come back out again. So there's that fear, I think, around going into the vortex rather than kind of coming through a tunnel, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, grief is like an ocean, in the Buddhist tradition. That's how they would, sadness is like an ocean, and it can really take us, that fear of being taken over by the ocean. But if we work at, whether we get help and sit in a therapy partnership, or that we find some way that we can transmute it, it becomes compassion. Sadness that's transmuted becomes compassion. But it is a scary place, because our culture doesn't really teach us how to be with these emotions,
Yeah, and I think I spoke to Julia about this session a while back, and her, Julia, so for people out there who don't know who Julia Samuel is kind of UK's foremost expert on grief. She's written 2 amazing books on the subject, and she very much believes in the experience, just allowing grief to happen. And she talks a lot about how with families where grief is stopped from happening, that the pain continues for generations. It holds families back for generations. But she also talks about the key thing is connection to others. So you can go into the darkness, but you do also need connection to others. I think that's a really important point to kind of table, because it isn't, there are people who, can go into the darkness and have a really good relationship with that and are practiced in it. But I think for people who are maybe just starting to explore their grief, or exploring allowing their grief or difficult emotions, that connection to others and love with others is so vital. And I think, Gary, that was very much your experience, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I was, my friend circle were amazing and were sort of there for me, sort of thing, but also allowed me the space to do what I felt I needed to do. And they were there, they knew they were available, but they would just say, how you doing? Do you want someone just to come around? Just be sat on the sofa. You don't have to say a word. I sometimes had a friend come round. They'd come in. This was back in the days when people could come into your house, and they'd come in and just, we'd pour a beer. And a mate would sit on the end of the sofa. I'd sit another. We wouldn't say a word practically all evening, and then go, I better go now. And just that acceptance of knowing that that's you were going to be in that place, and they let you be in that place, was something that was really rather good. Rather wonderful, I thought, and also in this day and age, the social media experience of connecting to people through that, people who are going through a similar thing, just that slight reach out and finding others in your tribe who get that was incredible. There'd be that time at like 2 a.m. when you're sat there and you haven't been able to sleep, and you were just feeling so dark, and I could just jump onto like Instagram Live or something and just go, oh, I'm feeling crap at the moment. I just wanted to say it out loud, and suddenly the little things would start pinging up at the bottom of the screen, and you'd know people were there and listening. And just that, someone just listening, was enough. But you didn't need them to input, to sort of feel that they had to say anything. They just sort of, a little heart would come up, and they knew that they were there, and you just go, thank you. And you could be sitting there talking away, but they go, oh, that's made me feel better. Thanks, guys. And then you'd go off, and so that was an incredible thing as well, I think. I think that's what you were talking about, wasn't it?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, Mary, we're talking about a bit about the ancestors and what was the wisdom that we've kind of maybe misplaced along the way. I don't like using the word lost, because I know that we have it. It's just that we have slightly misplaced it, left it on a different shelf that we don't really have access to. But I think that was something they understood, community around death, and maybe something that we find harder now because we're pain averse. We're slightly awkward around people who are in pain.
It's interesting that, sorry to jump in, and I know
okay.
But I've, in the last sort of month, I've lost 3 friends as well. I have 3 friends die in the last month for various things, and one of the common things that's happened with all of them is the almost instant celebration of them. So yes, there was that immediate the pain of the loss and the mourning that they've gone, but almost straight away with all of them, there's been a celebration of their life and who they were, and how lucky we were to know them. And it seems to be a theme that's coming through a lot these days. I know I move in a sort of arty circle, so perhaps it's easier for us to be like that, but I think there's a lot to be learned from it, of the yes, you acknowledge the pain, but also just going, but look at that, look at what they meant to us. And instead of going, we've lost that, going, weren't we lucky, and celebrating that has been really a positive experience recently. And it seems to be happening more and more in my own experience anyway.
That leads me on to, I always leave this one to last. It's just impossible to have a conversation about grief and death at the moment without talking about the past year, the pandemic, the profound losses that we've experienced on a global level. And I guess, my question to you first, Mary, is how can we find hope and meaning in nature? And have we been in a winter for the last year, and what can we learn from that?
We've definitely been in a winter. I think one of the biggest things we can learn is that there's a bigger cycle happening here. It's much bigger than our own lives, and that certainly is somewhere that helps me in terms of our evolutionary frame, looking at it in an evolutionary frame, which may seem like it's a very kind of big way to look, but it certainly suits my system when I think about, there's a massive, bigger cycle going on here, and I think my sense is, I've been tracking it, is like we're at the winter solstice of that bigger cycle right now. And so what do we do? What do the Celts suggest we do? There's gifts and challenges at each of these points, and what is it that we need, that we're being invited into at this time, is to just stay and listen. Now, there's obviously going to be people who want to be out in the front line and wanting, you know, certainty. But at the winter solstice, there is the return of the light. And I sense that right in the last couple of months, there's a slight return of the light. There's a slight sense of hope. Things like, as you're, Gary, you know, like I know loads of communities around the planet who are green shoots that are doing amazing work. So there is great hope, and I think the light has just returned, but it's so delicate. And what we're asked to at the winter solstice, between winter solstices Imbolc, which is I think where we're at, is to drop into an active waiting. It's like an active listening. What am I being called into? What is it that I, as having been born at this time, I'm being called into? Because I feel every single one of us is at a place, is on the earth to really contribute to this new way. And we have been in a winter, but we've been in a winter for a long time. We just, I think, have been in denial of it, and how we've treated our planet, and just even how we've been living. I think there's so much grief about how we've been living. I certainly feel it in me. And this great global pause that came this time last year was Mother Nature shaking us, the Cailleach, saying, you cannot live like this anymore. And so she brings us, and we, if we can, we let our leaves go. And what we'll show is our beautiful, the backbone of the tree will, if we really let go all that, how we're contributing, every single one of us, how we're contributing to this destruction of humanity and of the planet. And if we can do that, then, and we can then sit and wait in the not knowing and the dream time of this time. It's dream time. It's a soul making time where we're asked to be really live from a deeper place, more connected to each other, more connected to our great planet, and that we can create this amazing new world together, which will be the springtime will return. And I think we can really trust that. Well, I'm certainly feeling deeply connected into that. Green shoots, new possibilities. And then we start to choose of all the possibilities. What are we going to put our attention on? Are we going to attend to the non-stop 24-hour, you know, fear mongering that the media, this old broadcast style media, are offering us? Or are we going to put our attention on, there are some amazing people in the world, there's amazing things happening, a bit like what you did, Gary, with Joy, like you remembered what was great about her. And you went forward and brought your children through that. Not that it eased the pain, I'm sure, but just like in those last friends, that you've been celebrating their life. What was great about it? So that's where my sense is, that's where I feel into right now. And that's where I'm sitting in right now. And it's helping to soothe my system and keep me more open to uncertainty and not knowing.
That's amazing, Mary. And yeah, thank you for that. One thing that we've really noticed at Good Grief is that pause has also meant that a lot of people have had to confront grief that maybe they had not dealt with before, or they've had to confront their grief in a new way. And then obviously, many people who've been bereaved as a direct result of COVID, and also people who were bereaved during COVID, who haven't been able to, mourn their dead properly. Or in a new way. So we really noticed that there's this huge theme of grief at the moment, of this pause has made everybody stop, and suddenly they're confronted with whatever they were running from in this kind of, constantly on busy world. And that was an invitation. I personally feel that was an invitation to kind of say, here it is. You've got the time now. The world has stopped. You can confront this now, or you can continue to not confront it, which is a completely personal choice. But we've really noticed that a lot of people's old grief or unprocessed grief has surfaced over the past year.
They've had more time to sit and think and be with themselves, and surrounded by these other things, have brought those things back up to the surface again. And I think
Yeah.
And again, that a positive can be found in that, certainly, definitely. It's a time of contemplation, isn't it? The dark winter nights, You think about back the ancestors, they must have been, they couldn't go out, it was dark, physically, they would sit round the fire. It was a time of stories and being together and contemplation and being stuck in their roundhouses together, you know, sort of thing, rather than being out in the fields. So we've had that equivalent of that, laying down the stores ready for the spring, and now it's time to sort of start thinking about planting out again, and
yeah,
you know, and that's what we need to now do, is start planting the new crops that we're going to need going forwards, you know, metaphorically.
Yeah.
Love that as well. Good metaphor use. We're kind of coming to the end of our time, which I'm absolutely flabbergasted at. It feels like it's been about 20 minutes. I wanted to kind of finish up with a couple of questions for both of you. The first is, and I'll go to you first, Gary. What do you think Mother Nature would say to us if she could speak to us? I mean, she can speak to us, but if she could speak words to us
at this moment in time,
yeah,
you mean, I think she'd say, be patient, don't rush, the wheel is turning, and go with it.
Yeah, I like that. And Mary, what do you think she'd say?
I think she's roaring. I don't think she's saying anything quietly. But I like what you said, Gary, too. I think she's roaring. You can't live like this. So there is no return to a normal, what was. So yeah, what is it how are you contributing? How are each one of us contributing in our thoughts as much as in our actions around you know, how are we contributing to keeping the old system alive? And yeah, I love that, Gary, that, you know, trust and trust in the not knowing, because I have a plan. There's a bigger plan here.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's gorgeous. So my last question to both of you is, obviously there are a lot of people at home who are bereaved and who are dealing with very difficult emotions and going through really difficult times. And I wanted to know what would be from the wisdom of your life, and what you know of the wisdom of nature. And I'll go to you first, Mary. What's the wisdom your piece of wisdom that you'd like to impart to the people who are watching at home?
I think for my own life, it's learn to stop, learn to pause, and learn to drop inwards, and to really befriend your whatever is here, to include it all, and that the true liberation happens when we really look with kind eyes towards our pain and our resistance to that pain. Kind, compassionate, gentle eyes, with a softness, and yet a commitment to you really, just including everything, welcoming everything exactly as it is.
That's, the ultimate wisdom, isn't it? Just welcoming everything as it is. And Gary, the same question to you, finally.
I'd say trust the wheel. Trust the wheel. It must seem at times so dark, so hopeless. You're in this bottomless pit, but if you look directly across the wheel, the opposite is there, and that wheel is turning at whatever speed, and just trust the wheel and go with it, because the light will come around again.
Lovely. Yeah, absolutely. Two absolute nuggets of wisdom there from both of you at the end there, just like back of the net as your final piece. Thank you both so much for joining us today. This session has been a real dream to put together, and I really hope, and we really hope, that it offers some comfort and healing to people at home, because we so often don't talk about these subjects, and there's so much there that our ancestors knew that we need to take off the top shelf and put back into circulation again. We have a great resources page on our website. There's, for anybody who's kind of listened to this and so it's brought up difficult feelings, or you feel like you want to explore them a little bit more, head to goodgrieffest.com, and on the resources page you'll find a whole list of useful things there. And do join us in the chat. This is a pre-recorded session, so we're not doing Q&A, but do join us in the chat, and we've got members of the festival team who will be responding to questions there. So feel free to say hi. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much all for joining us today. And yeah, I'm really grateful to both Mary and Gary for this incredible conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Aisling. Thanks to all. It's this great festival that you're putting together. It's so important. Yeah.
Brilliant.